It began in November of 1962, on a night when the moon hung full and white over the woods of Hollowbrook. The brook itself was nothing special most of the year. A thin, winding current that threaded through stones and moss, quiet enough that children splashed in it during summer, quiet enough that fishermen claimed it never gave them more than minnows. But that November, it became something else. It became the place where the town's silence began. Peter Lang was 19, a boy more than a man, restless in that way small-town boys always are, his notebooks filled with half-finished songs and sketches of places he swore he'd someday see. He worked part-time at the hardware store, saved every dollar for a car that never came. By all accounts, Peter was ordinary. Until the night he didn't come home, it was his mother who noticed first. The bed unslept in, the lamp still on, his shoes missing from the mat by the door. She waited through the night, convinced he would return with some excuse about a friend, a girl, a late movie. But dawn came pale and heavy, and Peter did not. They found him at the brook. The discovery was not dramatic, just a man walking his dog, the leash pulling him toward the water's edge where the stones lay slick with moonlight. Peter's body was there, laid out carefully on the rocks as though someone had placed him down with deliberate hands. His eyes were closed, his hands folded loosely at his chest. It might have looked peaceful, if not for the wound. A single cut, precise, clean, across the throat. The coroner said later it was done with a steady hand, a practiced one. No hesitation, no jagged edge, just a line as sure as ink across paper. No weapon was ever found. No footprints led to or from the brook. It was as if he had walked himself to the stones, lain down, and the wound had appeared by the moon's light. But there was one thing. In his coat pocket, folded and damp, lay a page torn from his diary. His handwriting, neat but pressed hard into the paper as though he had written quickly, urgently. It said only, "He'll come again when the moon is full." The sheriff at the time, Harold Dawson, dismissed it as the rambling of a troubled boy, but others in town whispered, "How could he have known? He'll come again." As if Peter hadn't just feared something, but expected it. The funeral was small. The town's paper printed a short obituary calling it a tragedy, an isolated crime. People shook their heads, locked their doors, and told themselves Hollowbrook was safe again. But the brook remembered. And when the moon grew full the next November, the silence began all over again. November returned. The leaves withered and fell, the brook ran black under the bare branches, and the town of Hollowbrook began to breathe easier. A year had passed since Peter Lang's death, and time is supposed to soften grief, to file the edges of fear into something tolerable. By the first week of November 1963, people had almost convinced themselves it had been an accident, a mistake, a crime committed by a stranger who had long since moved on. Then came the second body. Her name was Margaret Kelly. 34 years old. A schoolteacher known for her quiet patience, the kind of woman who left apples on her desk long after her students had gone home. On the night of the full moon, she walked home from evening mass. The church bell had just finished tolling when she stepped into the dark. She never arrived at her house. The next morning, a boy delivering newspapers found her. Same place, the brook. Same stones slick with moonlight. Same wound, clean and final across the throat. The sheriff, Harold Dawson, tried to keep order, but the town felt the weight immediately. Once might be chance. Twice on the same night of the same month was something else, and there was another detail. In Margaret Kelly's purse lay a folded scrap of paper, tucked inside her hymn book. It bore no signature, just 6 words written in hurried script, ink blurred but legible. "He'll come again when the moon is full." The same line, the same warning. Some said Peter Lang had written it before he died and someone had planted it. Others whispered Margaret had written it herself. A few swore the brook was writing now, passing notes from the dead to the living. At her funeral, people kept their eyes lowered. The church pews were full, but the silence was heavier than the hymns. Children were told not to walk near the brook. Couples left lanterns burning in their windows through the night. And in the diner, voices dropped whenever the full moon was mentioned. The fear was no longer spoken as rumor. It was carved into the air of the town. Something was happening in Hollowbrook, and it would not end with Margaret Kelly. The sheriff stood on the stones where her body had been laid. The water moved gently, as if nothing had happened, carrying leaves and moonlight downstream. Dawson felt a chill in his bones he couldn't explain. He wrote in his report that the case remained open, the investigation ongoing. But in the margin of his notes, he scribbled something no one else saw. It wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. By the 3rd November, Hollowbrook was holding its breath. Families prayed the deaths of Peter Lang and Margaret Kelly had been cruel chance, the kind of tragedies small towns are never built to carry. But when the calendar edged toward the full moon of 1964, the air grew tighter. Windows were latched, curtains drawn, and the streets emptied earlier each night. It didn't matter. On November 14th, the body of Samuel Carter was found near the brook. He was just 22, a mill worker walking home from the late shift. His body lay in the same position as the others, stretched neatly across the wet stones, as if placed there with care. The wound was the same, clean, precise, and in his pocket, another scrap of paper. He'll come again when the moon is full. By then, even the sheriff couldn't deny the truth. The following year, 1965, it happened again. This time it was a girl only 17, Alice Monroe, returning from a friend's house. Her mother waited at the door, watching for her silhouette on the path. She never came. They found her the next morning, where the brook bent shallow. Her hands were folded, her eyes closed, her hair spread across the stones like threads of dark water. Same wound, same moon. And then, in 1966, another. 3 years in a row, 4 deaths in 4 Novembers, each one echoing the last, as if a ritual had been written and the town was trapped inside it. Sheriff Dawson kept files thick with photographs, reports, statements. The pages smelled of damp earth and ink, his handwriting cramped in the margins. He circled dates, compared moon phases, sketched maps of the brook. But the details always ended the same way. No footprints, no drag marks, just the wound and the silence. It was Dawson's deputy who said it aloud first. "It's a pattern," he muttered late one night, when the office was empty but for the hum of the desk lamp. "It's not chance. It's a rhythm. Someone is keeping time." And the town began to believe it. By the late 1960s, Hollowbrook had stopped calling the killings tragedies. They had another word for it, a quieter word, but heavier. Curse. The curse of Hollowbrook. It spread in whispers. At the schoolyard, at the bar, in the pews after Sunday Mass. Mothers told their children not to look at the brook when the moon was high. Teenagers dared each other to walk its edge and swore they heard voices in the rustling leaves. Men claimed they smelled peppermint along the water, though no one carried it. The brook flowed on, dark and steady, a mirror for the moon. And every November, when its reflection grew full and bright, Hollowbrook remembered the pattern. Because patterns, once written in blood, are not easily erased. By the end of 1966, Hollowbrook had stopped pretending. The murders were no longer isolated tragedies whispered about in kitchens and church basements. They had become the town's shadow. The curse, some called it, the cycle, others said. Whatever the name, it was the thing no one could escape when November came. Shops closed early during the week of the full moon. The diner, once the warmest place in town, served its last cups of coffee before 10 and sent customers home with their heads bent against the night. The hardware store boarded its windows. Even the post office locked its doors 2 hours early, as if the killer respected business hours. Parents drew their children in close. Doors were locked not just with keys, but with heavy chairs pushed up against the knobs. Some families lit candles in every window, hoping to ward off whatever spirit haunted the brook. Others placed bowls of salt at their thresholds, a practice remembered from older generations, half believed but followed all the same. The school enforced an unofficial curfew. Students weren't permitted to linger after sports practice or choir rehearsals. Teachers walked the younger ones home in pairs, raincoats pulled tight against the November chill. But even with precautions, fear seeped into every corner. At church, Father Harrington's sermons grew darker. He spoke of sin stalking the righteous, of cycles that only repentance could break. Parishioners bowed their heads, but afterward, in hushed voices, many admitted the killings felt older than any sermon, deeper than any scripture. At the mill, men gathered in groups during their smoke breaks, eyes always drawn to the tree line. "He'll come again when the moon is full," they muttered, the words more chant than warning. Teenagers, reckless as they always are, turned fear into dares. They crept to the brook at night, daring one another to stand on the stones where the bodies had been found. Some swore they heard the sound of footsteps behind them. Others said they smelled peppermint, sharp and cold, carried on the mist. None of them stayed long. And yet, through all of this, life continued. Bread still baked in the ovens. Cars still rolled down Main Street. Babies were still born. Hollowbrook lived on, but it lived around the silence. The killings were not spoken of directly. They were referred to only as that night or when the moon comes. The words murder and killer rarely left anyone's lips, because words have weight. And in Hollowbrook, people believed that to name the horror aloud was to invite it closer. The brook flowed on, carrying the reflection of the moon in its dark waters, and the town, year after year, waited for November, knowing what always came with it. Not a question of if, only when. The brook had always been there. Long before Hollowbrook was a town, before the sawmill and the church and the diner, the water ran its crooked line through the valley. The earliest maps marked it simply as the Hollowbrook, a thin vein of black ink threading between hills. But those who lived beside it spoke of it differently. It was not a river, too narrow, too hushed, not a stream either, too steady, too deep in places where the current hid its strength. It was something in between, a piece of water that seemed unwilling to choose what it was. In daylight, the brook could almost look ordinary. Sunlight filtered through trees, dappling its surface in patches of gold. Children waded barefoot in its shallows, their laughter bouncing off the rocks. Fishermen leaned on its banks with rods and lines, pulling up the occasional trout. But in November, when the leaves had fallen and the sky grew pale, the brook changed. The water turned dark, its surface reflecting the moon so clearly it looked more like glass than moving current. The stones along its edge grew slick with frost, and the trees bent close, their branches skeletal, as if listening. And always the sound. The brook was never loud. Even in storms, it didn't roar the way rivers do. It whispered, a steady murmur, like words spoken just out of reach. If you stood alone at night, the water at your feet, it was easy to imagine it was talking. Some said it called their names. Others swore it hummed like a lullaby. Older families in Hollowbrook told stories about it. That long ago, travelers disappeared along its banks, that lanterns were seen floating over its surface with no hand to carry them, that once every year the brook asked for something and the town gave it, whether willingly or not. The stones where the bodies were found seemed to confirm the stories. They were flat, slick, and arranged in a natural platform near the water's bend, almost like an altar, always the same place, always under the same moon. When the sheriff's deputies searched those stones, they found nothing unusual. No footprints, no blood trails. The bodies had been placed there, but how and by whom was never clear. Some said the brook kept its own secrets, that it swallowed what it wanted, left behind only what it chose. And every November, when the full moon rose and its reflection stretched pale across the water, the people of Hollowbrook felt the weight of its presence. It was not just the scene of a crime. It was part of the crime itself. The brook had become more than a body of water. It had become a boundary between the living and the dead, between silence and confession, between what the town dared to say and what it never would. And as the years passed, it seemed the brook was not done remembering. Not yet. Sheriff Harold Dawson had been a lawman most of his life. By 1962, he was nearing 60, a man carved from years of routine. Bar fights at the tavern, the occasional stolen car, the quiet duties of keeping order in a small town that rarely demanded much. But when Peter Lang's body was found, something shifted in him. He wrote in his logbook that night, "This feels different. This will not go away quickly." By the second year, when Margaret Kelly was discovered on the same stones, Dawson understood he was standing at the edge of something larger than himself. He began to keep 2 sets of notes. The official reports, typed neatly and filed in the courthouse, and a second journal written in his cramped, slanted hand, hidden in his desk. In those pages he wrote not as a sheriff, but as a man afraid. November 1963. Same wound, same place, not chance. Pattern beginning. November 1964. Carter boy. Brook takes again. Precise cut. Clean. Who knows how? Why? November 1965. It's not a man. Can't be. No tracks, no sound but water. Yet bodies come. Same hands arranging them. November 1966. If it is a man, he hides better than any I've known. But my bones say it's the brook, or what lives in it. At town meetings, Dawson stood steady, promising increased patrols, curfews, vigilance. But in private, his deputies said they found him walking the brook at night, lantern in hand, muttering to himself as though he were trying to bargain with the water. One deputy recalled seeing Dawson kneel at the stones where Margaret had been found, pressing his palm flat to the rock as if listening. "He looked up at me," the deputy said years later, "and he was pale as the moon. He told me the stone was warm." The sheriff never spoke of it again. By the late 1960s, the murders had become more than cases. They had become his burden. He aged faster, his hair turning white in a matter of winters. He drank heavily but never at the tavern, only alone, at his desk, staring at the maps of the brook. He told his wife once, in a rare moment of openness, "It's not a killer I'm chasing, it's a clock. Every November it ticks, and one day it'll tick for me." When Dawson retired in 1970, his successor inherited boxes of files, photographs, diagrams, clippings, but the hidden journal, the one he had kept locked in his desk, disappeared. Some say his family burned it. Others believe he left it buried near the brook, pages swallowed by the earth, joining the secrets of the stones. What remained of Sheriff Dawson was only his silence, and the brook, still waiting for its next November. In the fall of 1967, Hollowbrook braced itself for another November. By then, 4 bodies had already been claimed. The town kept its doors locked, its children close, its prayers whispered more urgently. And still, when the full moon rose, the pattern returned. This time, the victim was Thomas Bell, a quiet man who worked at the feed store. He never made it home from closing up one Friday night. His body was found the next morning at the brook, laid carefully across the same stones, the same wound carved across his throat. But that year, there was something new. a witness. Her name was Ruthie Callahan, a seamstress who lived near the tree line that overlooked the water. She was known for her sharp eyes. She noticed loose threads no one else did, spotted stains invisible to others. On the night Thomas Bell vanished, Ruthie claimed she saw movement outside her window. The fog was thick, she said, spilling low from the brook, curling up into the branches. In the pale light of the full moon, she made out a figure standing near the water's edge. Tall, narrow, still. At first I thought it was a man, she told the sheriff, but he didn't move, didn't breathe. The fog curled around him like he was a tree. I watched for what felt like minutes, and he never shifted, never bent, just stood there, as though he belonged to the mist. When Dawson pressed her for details, she grew uneasy. It wasn't just the stillness. It was the smell, peppermint, strong enough to sting my nose. Who smells like peppermint in the middle of the night? By the time she gathered the courage to step out onto her porch, the figure was gone. The fog had thinned, the brook whispered on, and there was nothing left but silence. The sheriff wrote her statement into the file but marked it in the margin with a single word: unreliable. He couldn't risk the town spiraling further into hysteria. Still, among his deputies, the story spread. The fog, the peppermint, the tall figure that watched but never moved. When Thomas Bell's funeral came, Ruthie stood at the back of the church, her hands twisting the hem of her dress. Later, she confided to a friend that she hadn't just seen the figure. She had the terrible feeling that it had seen her too. The brook took again that November. And for the first time, Hollowbrook had a glimpse, not of the killer's face, but of the shadow that lingered in the mist. Peter Lang had been gone 5 years by then, but his name was still whispered whenever November came. He was remembered as the first, the boy who had somehow known what was coming, the one whose diary carried the warning that became the heartbeat of the case. He'll come again when the moon is full. For years, the town believed that was all the diary had to say. But in 1967, during a fresh review of the files, Sheriff Dawson's deputy uncovered pages that had been overlooked, torn, water-stained, tucked in the back of the book as though someone had tried to hide them. The entries began a month before Peter's death. At first, they seemed ordinary, fragments of a restless teenager's life. Notes about friends, complaints about work at the hardware store, sketches of cars he wanted to own someday. But slowly, the tone shifted. October 12, 1962. Walked home past the brook tonight. Thought I heard whistling. No one there. It stopped when I stopped. October 19th. Dreamed the brook was inside my room. Water under the bed. When I woke, my shoes were wet. October 24th. There's someone in the fog, tall, watching. I know it's not a trick. Smelled peppermint, strong as smoke. October 30th. It's not just me. Saw Alice cross the bridge. She heard it too. Said it was like someone breathing just over her shoulder. November 2nd. Can't stop thinking about the stones. They look like a bed. Or an altar. I feel like they've been waiting for me. The final entry, dated November 8th, was written with such force the pen nearly tore through the page. He'll come again when the moon is full. I think he wants me. If it happens, don't let them bury me near the brook. That request was never honored. Peter was buried in Ashen Hill Cemetery, just up the rise, close enough that the brook's whisper might still reach him in the ground. When the deputy showed Dawson the entries, the sheriff closed the book quietly and said nothing for a long time. At last he muttered, "The boy knew." Then he locked the diary away in the evidence cabinet where it stayed until the files themselves went missing years later. The diary became more than a record. It became prophecy. Each November, when another body was found, people remembered Peter's words. not as a warning, as a promise fulfilled. The funerals in Hollowbrook followed a pattern almost as precise as the killings. The church bells tolled. The townspeople gathered. The coffins, plain pine for some, dark oak for others, were carried up the narrow aisle. Words were spoken, hymns were sung, but the silence was always heavier than the sound. When Peter Lang was buried in '62, the service was hushed but hopeful. People still believed it a single tragedy, the work of chance or a passing drifter. The pews were full, voices lifted with solemn clarity, and afterward, neighbors brought casseroles and bread to his mother's door. Hollowbrook still believed in comfort then. By the time Margaret Kelly was laid to rest the following year, the tone had changed. Fewer voices sang. Eyes lingered on the stained glass as if seeking answers in the light. Mothers held their children tighter. The air was thick with unspoken worry. What if it happens again? When Samuel Carter's coffin was lowered into the ground in 1964, the silence inside the church had grown unbearable. It wasn't grief alone. It was fear. Men shifted uncomfortably, hats clenched in their hands. Women avoided eye contact, whispering prayers under their breath. Even Father Harrington faltered, his voice trembling as he spoke of eternal rest. And then came Alice Munro, just 17, buried in '65. Her classmates lined the pews, their faces pale, their youth shadowed by something too dark to understand. A single rose lay on her coffin, placed by her best friend. When the final hymn ended, no one lingered to speak. The congregation spilled out into the cold November air, but the chatter that usually followed funerals was gone. The silence walked with them, heavy as a second procession. By 1966, at Thomas Bell's service, the ritual had become almost mechanical. Families showed up because it was expected. They bowed their heads, murmured along with the prayers, and filed out. No one spoke of justice anymore. No one asked who. They simply endured, as though the funerals themselves had become part of the cycle, another November obligation. It was Ruthie Callahan, the seamstress who had glimpsed the figure in the fog, who later said it best. We stopped burying people. We started burying hope. The cemetery on the hill began to collect them, one by one, names etched into stone, dates fixed beneath them, each line of granite like a mark on the town's calendar. November after November, Hollowbrook, dressed in black, lowered its dead, and carried silence home like a second shadow. And always, the brook whispered on, as though it were keeping count. By 1970, Sheriff Harold Dawson was a shell of the man who had first stood on the stones in '62. His hair had gone white, his hands trembled when he held a pen, and his eyes seemed fixed always on some point far away, as though the brook itself had taken up residence behind them. He retired quietly. No speeches, no ceremony. Just a box of uniforms folded neatly, a set of keys placed on his desk, and the files. Boxes of them. Thick with photographs, reports, newspaper clippings, and his own cramped notes. The man who inherited them was Sheriff William Hayes, younger, sharper, with the kind of confidence that comes before experience teaches humility. He believed in order, in reason, in answers. He promised the town that under his watch the killings would end. He took Dawson's boxes home that first week, spreading the files across his dining room table. He stayed up late into the night, poring over the evidence. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Always November. Always the full moon. Always the brook. Always the wound. But Hayes didn't believe in curses. He believed in people. And if people bled, then people killed. He built timelines, cross-referenced alibis, checked arrest records from neighboring towns. He sent requests to the state police for assistance, pushed for lab work on fibers and soil samples. All things Dawson had never trusted. For Hayes, this wasn't about whispers or the weight of silence. It was about procedure. And yet even Hayes began to feel it. On his second week in office, he drove to the brook at night, just to see the place for himself. He stood on the stones where so many bodies had been found. The water moved dark and steady, carrying the reflection of the moon. The woods around him were still, except for the sound of the brook whispering. He stayed only minutes, but later he admitted he left with a strange heaviness in his chest. "Like I'd been counted," he wrote in his logbook. The deputies noticed changes in him after that. Hayes still spoke with confidence, still worked the files, but his eyes lingered too long on the calendar pinned above his desk. His voice dropped lower when he spoke of November. And when the full moon came in 1971 and another body was found by the water, Hayes stopped talking about bringing the killer to justice. Instead, he began asking quieter questions. What if the brook itself is choosing? It was the beginning of his unraveling. A man who came in with faith in evidence, but found himself caught in the same silence that had swallowed Dawson. Because in Hollowbrook, the badge didn't protect you. The files didn't protect you. Nothing did, when the moon turned full and the brook remembered. By the mid-60s, the murders were no longer single tragedies. They were a sequence, a grim drumbeat the town braced for each November. And with each body, the brook seemed less like a place and more like a calendar, marking time in blood. 1964. Samuel Carter. He was 22, a mill worker with calloused hands and a shy smile. He lived with his mother on the east side of town, saving money to marry his sweetheart. On November 14th, he left the mill after a late shift. His boots were still damp with sawdust when they found him by the water the next morning. His body was placed carefully on the stones, the brook sliding black at his side. The wound was the same as Peter's, the same as Margaret's. Clean, final. In his pocket was a slip of paper, edges damp, with the same line written in hurried hand. He'll come again when the moon is full. At his funeral, his mother whispered to the coffin, "I knew the brook would take you." 1965. Alice Monroe. She was only 17. Her friends said she loved to sing, always humming tunes in the hallway, always laughing louder than the others. On November 5th, she stayed late at a friend's house to study. She was last seen walking home under a pale, swollen moon. Her mother watched the clock until midnight, then called the sheriff when Alice still hadn't returned. They found her the next day, laid out on the same stones, her hair fanned like dark threads across the rock, her throat cut with the same precision. No struggle, no sign of a chase, just silence. In her school notebook, tucked inside her bag, there was a single line written on the back page in ink darker than the rest. "He'll come again when the moon is full." Her classmates filled the church pews, their songs breaking into sobs. For weeks after, they swore they heard her humming in the hallways. 1966. Thomas Bell. He was 36, a feed store clerk known for his kindness, the kind of man who carried grain bags for older farmers and slipped extra feed to hungry dogs. On November 19th, he closed the shop and headed home. He never arrived. Ruthie Callahan, the seamstress, claimed she saw a tall figure in the fog that night, standing by the brook, peppermint sharp on the air. The next morning, Thomas lay on the stones. Same wound, same placement, same silence. In his pocket, too, was the line. This time not handwritten. It was clipped from a newspaper, glued to the scrap. "He'll come again when the moon is full." The message had evolved, as if someone, or something, was making sure the words themselves survived, no matter the form. By 1966, the people of Hollowbrook stopped asking if the killings would happen again. They only asked who. Parents warned their children not to walk alone. Teenagers dared each other to sneak to the brook. Old men muttered in bars that it wasn't a man at all, but the brook itself, keeping its bargain with the moon. And in Sheriff Dawson's private notes, written in his shaking hand, a single line appeared after Thomas Bell's death. "It isn't stopping. It never will." By the winter of 1966, the killings had ceased to feel like crimes. They had become inevitabilities. And when people spoke of them at all, in whispers over coffee or behind church doors, they began to use a new name. The November Curse. It was the children who coined it first. They whispered it at school, half as dare, half as prayer, daring each other to walk past the brook during the full moon. They made up rhymes, little sing-song chants. When the moon is round and bright, the brook will take a life that night. Teachers scolded them, but the words spread anyway. And soon even adults began to mutter them, as though naming the fear made it easier to carry. By the late 1960s, Hollowbrook no longer trusted November. Weddings were never planned that month. Families avoided travel. Hunters stayed out of the woods. Even the church kept its doors locked after evening mass. Stories grew. Some swore they saw lights along the brook, lanterns bobbing though no hands carried them. Others claimed the water ran red beneath the moon, though the sheriff found no evidence of it. And there was always the whisper of peppermint on the air, sharp and out of place. Each year, as the calendar turned, the town braced itself. Children were kept inside. Women walked in pairs. Men gathered in bars and spoke in low voices, all the while keeping one ear tilted toward the woods. The phrase from Peter Lang's diary, "He'll come again when the moon is full," had become a kind of prophecy. No longer tied to one boy's frightened words, it was repeated in kitchens, written on chalkboards, muttered before bed. The curse was not just about death. It was about waiting. The sense that Hollowbrook was trapped in a rhythm older than itself, one it could neither stop nor escape. Even Sheriff Dawson, stubborn to the last, began to refer to it that way in private. In his notes from 1967, he scribbled, "This is not a killer. This is a clock. It keeps November. It keeps us." And so, each year the town prepared. Not for justice, not for answers, but for endurance. Because the brook had written its rules, and Hollowbrook had learned to obey them. And the rules were simple. When November came, so would the silence, and someone would not return. In November of 1968, the curse claimed another life. A boy named Daniel Whitaker, just 16. He was walking home from the library, a stack of borrowed books tucked under his arm. The next morning, the books were found scattered along the brook's edge, their pages soaked through, their ink bleeding into the water like veins. Daniel's body was laid across the stones, his throat marked by the same wound, his hands folded neatly as if someone had arranged them. For the Whitakers, it was too much. Hollowbrook had taken their son. They would not let it take the rest of them. By spring, they had sold the house, packed their belongings, and moved 3 towns over. It was the first time a family had abandoned Hollowbrook outright because of the curse. At first, they seemed to find relief. Their new home was farther from the woods, the air lighter, the neighbors unburdened by November shadows, but the silence followed. Mrs. Whitaker later told a cousin that on their very first November in the new town, she woke to the sound of running water. Though no faucets were open, no rain was falling. The sound came from under the floorboards, a steady murmur like a brook passing beneath the house. When she rose to check, she found Daniel's books, the ones they had buried with him, stacked neatly by the door. Dry, whole, waiting. Her husband tried to dismiss it as grief, but their daughter Emma spoke of something worse. She said she dreamed of the brook every night that month, its stones slick under moonlight, its water whispering her name. and in the dream, her brother stood on the far bank, holding out a peppermint candy in his palm. When she woke, her bedsheets were damp, as though water had seeped into the room. The Whitakers lasted 2 more years in their new town. But when the November moon rose each year, the same signs returned: damp footprints on the floor, the smell of peppermint in the air, the sound of water in the walls. They moved again after that. Farther still. No one knows what became of them. Some say they live in another state now, their names changed, their past buried. Others whisper they never truly escaped, that once the brook counts you among its dead, you carry its silence no matter where you go. In Hollowbrook, the Whitakers became a story told in hushed voices. The family who tried to outrun November, only to find the brook runs longer than any road. By 1969, the murders had already shaped Hollowbrook's rhythm. One life each November, the brook claiming and the town mourning. But that year, something new slipped into the pattern. It began with children. On the nights leading up to the full moon, those who lived closest to the brook told their parents they heard someone whistling. The tune was faint, no more than a thread of sound, but distinct. A slow, looping melody that rose and fell like the water itself. At first, parents dismissed it. Children imagine things. The woods are full of noises. But then grown men began to hear it too. Farmers walking home late swore they caught snatches of song in the fog. Women drawing water from wells stopped mid-motion, certain someone was humming just out of sight. Always the same tune. Always near the brook. Always in November. On November 22, 1969, the body of Helen Fry was found. She was a librarian, well-liked, known for reading stories to children in the afternoons. Her body lay across the stones like the others, the same wound at her throat. But her case carried an added detail. In her pocket, police discovered a folded piece of sheet music, water-stained. Half the notes blurred away. At the top, written in an unfamiliar hand, "He'll come again when the moon is full." The deputies couldn't say where the music came from. None of her family recognized it, and yet, those who had heard the brookside whistling swore the notes on that page matched the tune exactly. From that year on, people began calling it the Brook's Song. Teenagers dared each other to listen for it, creeping close to the stones with their ears straining against the fog. Some swore the tune changed depending on who listened. A boy said he heard it as a lullaby. A woman said it sounded like a hymn. An old man said it was a funeral march, but no matter the shape it took, the rhythm was the same. 4 notes, a pause, 4 again, the same rhythm as the footsteps, the same rhythm as the curse. At Helen Fry's funeral, Father Harrington refused to let music be played at all. He feared it would echo the brook's melody. The congregation sat in silence, hands folded, as though waiting for the water itself to hum through the walls. Afterward, Ruthie Callahan, the seamstress who had once glimpsed the figure in the fog, whispered, "The brook doesn't just take. It sings for what it wants." And Hollowbrook listened. Because once you've heard a song in the water, silence is never truly silent again. By the dawn of the 1970s, Sheriff William Hayes sat at a desk buried under papers, maps, and photographs, and still he had nothing. The Hollowbrook files had grown thick enough to fill 3 cabinets, each victim carefully documented, each scene photographed from every angle. The brook's stones repeated in image after image, slick and glistening under different Novembers, the same wound, the same silence, always the same, but for all the paper, there was no progress. Deputies admitted in quiet moments that evidence seemed to vanish. A bloodied scrap of cloth logged one evening would be missing from the evidence room by morning. A shoe print cast in plaster crumbled to dust before it could be tested. Even photographs developed clear would sometimes show only fog where a figure had once been. Hayes began requesting help from the state police. Forensic teams came, walked the brook, tested the water, lifted samples from the stones. Each time, they left with the same report. No viable evidence. Scene appears undisturbed. Undisturbed, as though the brook itself had washed away what it did not want them to find. The sheriff tried interviews, neighbors, families, drifters passing through. Each November, the questioning began again, the same faces, the same tired answers. But nothing connected. No pattern of work schedules, no overlap in friendships, no common thread in the lives cut short, except the brook. The press, at first eager, grew weary. Headlines that once screamed Brookside Butcher shrank to small columns buried deep in the paper. Outside, towns whispered of Hollowbrook as cursed ground, a place where reason had no purchase. Inside Hollowbrook, faith in law collapsed quietly. Parents stopped reporting children missing until morning, convinced the sheriff could do nothing. Widows stopped asking for updates on their husbands' cases. People stopped looking Hayes in the eye when they passed him on Main Street, as though his failure might be contagious. The sheriff himself began to fray. He smoked constantly, the ashtray on his desk overflowing by noon. His hands shook when he signed reports. At night, he drove alone to the brook, parking on the dirt road and sitting with the headlights off, watching the mist shift across the stones. He swore the peppermint smell clung to his clothes afterward, even though he carried no candy. In his private notes, Hayes wrote, "It's not that the trail is cold. It's that there was never a trail at all. We are not chasing a man. We are chasing silence, and silence leaves nothing behind." By 1972, the files had grown heavier, the deputies more tired, and the town more resigned. The investigation had not ended, but it had stalled into ritual. Reports written, boxes stored, calendars marked, waiting for November to come again. And always it came. By the early 1970s, belief in the sheriff's office had thinned to nothing. No arrests, no suspects, just files stacked like gravestones in the courthouse basement. And yet every November, the bodies kept appearing. So the town turned inward, toward ritual, toward superstition. The first vigil was small. A handful of families, mostly mothers, gathered along the brook with candles in their hands. They stood on the banks in silence, the wax dripping down their fingers, the flames swaying in the cold night air. Some prayed aloud, others simply watched, eyes fixed on the stones where so many had been found. The sheriff tried to disperse them at first, warning it was unsafe. But the women stood their ground, their voices soft but firm. "If we leave it alone," one of them told him, "it'll just keep taking." By the next year, more joined, dozens, then hundreds. Candles lined the bank like stars fallen from the sky, each flame trembling against the fog. Hymns rose into the night, low and wavering, carried across the water until they sounded like voices not entirely human. And still, even with the town gathered, the curse did not pause. One November, as the vigil stretched into its second hour, the brook ran black and silent. People stood shoulder to shoulder, lips moving in prayer. Yet by morning, another body was there, laid gently on the stones, no more than 100 yards from where the candles had flickered through the night. The vigils continued anyway, perhaps because people believed the act itself mattered, perhaps because silence felt heavier at home. Standing together, they could share the weight. Alone, they could not. Children were taught to hold candles too, their small faces glowing orange in the darkness. Old men hummed the hymn without words, their voices rough with years of smoke and sorrow. Teenagers, once reckless enough to taunt the brook, now stood with bowed heads, afraid to raise their eyes. There were stories, of course. People said they saw shadows moving just beyond the tree line, tall and narrow, lingering in the fog. Others swore their candles blew out without wind, as if a breath had passed over them. And there was always the smell, faint but sharp, peppermint carried on the mist. One year, a child asked his mother why they brought candles if they didn't stop the killings. She held him close and whispered, "We don't light them for the dead. We light them so the living aren't left in the dark." The vigils became part of Hollowbrook's rhythm, as much a fixture of November as the murders themselves. The brook claimed, the town wept, the candles burned. And still, the water whispered on, indifferent to flame, to prayer, to silence. By 1973, the Hollowbrook files filled more than 3 cabinets in the courthouse basement. Boxes labeled by year, folders thick with photographs, notebooks of interviews. Each November, another box was added. Each November, the same cycle repeated. But deputies began to notice something strange. The files were not staying whole. The first loss seemed small, a single plaster cast of a shoe print taken near the brook in 1968. It had been logged, bagged, shelved. When Sheriff Hayes requested it 2 weeks later, the bag was empty. Only dust, fine as ash, clung to the plastic. Then photographs went missing. Clear images of Alice Munro's school book, where the strange line had been scrawled across the back page. Gone. Negative strips remained, but when reprinted they showed nothing but fog and blurred stone. One deputy swore he had logged a bloody button, found snagged on a branch just above the brook. When he returned to the evidence room the next morning, the envelope was there, still sealed. But inside was only a clean, unmarked button, as if the blood had never existed. By 1975, Hayes no longer trusted the files. He began carrying pieces of evidence home in his briefcase, locking them in the drawer beside his bed. Still, even there, things shifted. A knife handle once tagged for analysis simply disappeared. Pages from his own notes tore themselves loose, found later crumpled near his back porch. The deputies whispered among themselves that the brook was washing the case away, not just in the water, but in the paper, too. "It doesn't want to be remembered," one said. "It keeps what it wants, and it erases the rest." Hayes grew more desperate. He wrote long letters to the state lab, demanding accountability. He threatened his deputies with dismissal if they didn't keep better track. But deep down, he knew it wasn't negligence. It was something else. One night, his wife found him sitting in the living room with the boxes spread open, photographs laid out on the floor. He was staring at one of the oldest, Peter Lang, on the stones, his face pale under moonlight. She asked why he was sitting there in the dark. Hayes didn't look up. He only whispered, "They're fading." She thought he meant the photographs. But later, Hayes admitted that wasn't it. He swore he could remember details, wounds, positions, objects, that no longer appeared in the pictures at all. The case wasn't just unsolved. It was unraveling, one detail at a time, as if the brook itself had reached into the files and drawn the silence over them. By the mid-70s, the Hollowbrook murders weren't only about the dead, they were about forgetting. And in a town already buried in silence, forgetting was another kind of death. If you ask the oldest families in Hollowbrook what they remember most about the years the curse grew strongest, some won't mention the bodies. They won't talk about the funerals, the vigils, or the endless silence. Instead, they'll talk about him, the man with the mints. Every October, when the harvest fair came to town, people swore they saw him. Tall, narrow-shouldered, always wearing a hat pulled low enough to hide his eyes. He wasn't part of the fair, not on any vendor list, but he slipped among the booths all the same. He sold peppermints, small white discs wrapped in wax paper, stacked neatly in a shallow tin, a dime each. No one remembered him calling out, hawking his wares like the other vendors. He didn't need to. Children said the smell reached them first, sharp, cold, cutting through the air heavier than the scent of hay and cider. By the time they looked up, he was there, palm outstretched, mints waiting. Some swore the candy was colder than it should have been, chilling the tongue like snow. Others said the taste lingered, not sweet, but metallic, like blood against the teeth. And then, just before November's full moon, he vanished. Every year, gone without farewell. No one ever saw where he came from, or where he went. The connection to the murders wasn't made immediately. But as the years passed, as the bodies mounted, whispers grew. Peter Lang had been seen buying a mint from him the year he died. Alice Munro, too. Even Thomas Bell, the feed store clerk, had been spotted at the fair, unwrapping one of the little candies as he walked home. By the 1970s, people spoke of him openly. They called him the stranger with mints, or, in darker tones, the peppermint man. The sheriff dismissed the stories at first. But when he pulled vendor lists from the fair committee's files, he found no trace of such a man, no permit, no booth, no name. And yet, half the town remembered seeing him. Children remembered the smell. One witness, a farmer named Al Griggs, swore under oath he saw the man's tin 1 year after dark. He claimed the peppermints weren't candy at all, but smooth white stones wrapped in paper. When asked why he hadn't taken one to prove it, Al only shook his head. "Didn't want to know what I'd be owing," he muttered. And still, the peppermint man returned. October after October. Vanishing with the leaves. By then, Hollowbrook no longer questioned whether he was real. The only question was whether he was selling candy or collecting names. Most stories in Hollowbrook ended with silence. A missing person, a body on the stones, a wound that said everything words could not. But in 1974, one story did not end that way. It came from a boy named Michael Reeves, just 15 at the time. He had been walking home from a friend's house, the November moon swelling above the trees. His path carried him close to the brook. Close enough, he later said, to hear it whisper. Michael had grown up with the stories. He knew the warnings. Don't linger near the water. Don't go out alone when the moon is full. But he was young, restless, and dared himself to prove braver than the curse. Halfway across the small footbridge, he stopped. The water below gleamed silver, and the stones seemed to glow faintly in the mist. He counted his own footsteps, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he froze, because something else was counting too. Behind him, matching him, 4 steps, a pause, 4 again. At first he thought it was an echo, but echoes don't pause when you pause. And when Michael stopped, the steps went on, slow, deliberate, drawing closer. He turned sharply, heart pounding, but the bridge behind him was empty, the mist unbroken. Still, the footsteps continued. "I could feel it," he told the sheriff years later, "like someone was there, just out of sight, breathing down my neck. But when I spun around, there was nothing, just the sound, the steps, and peppermint, sharp enough to burn." Michael ran. His feet slapped the boards, breath ragged, the echo pounding after him. Always 4 beats, always the pause. He didn't stop until he reached his front porch, where his father yanked him inside, pale and shaking. The boy survived. For once, the brook did not take. But he was never the same. Michael dropped out of school a year later. He wouldn't walk anywhere near the brook. He avoided bridges altogether. When he did speak of that night, his voice grew thin. "It wasn't just footsteps," he said. "It was like the brook was learning mine, like it was practicing." The sheriff wrote his account into the file, but in the margin he scrawled, "Unreliable, frightened boy. And yet, in Hollowbrook, people repeated Michael's story. Not because they doubted him, but because they knew the rhythm he described. 4 beats, a pause, 4 again. It was the rhythm the brook had kept for years, the rhythm of the curse itself. In November of 1975, as the town braced for another body, something arrived that had never come before. A letter. It was discovered one morning in the courthouse mailbox, sealed in a plain envelope without a stamp, without an address. Just slid into the slot sometime in the night. The paper inside was heavy, old-fashioned, the kind that held ink without bleeding, and the words written across it were in green, bold strokes. He returns with the moon. No signature. No date. Nothing more. Sheriff Hayes held the letter for a long time before speaking. The ink smelled faintly metallic, like copper. He asked his deputies if anyone had seen a stranger near the courthouse after hours. No one had. The letter was logged into evidence, though by then everyone knew how little that meant. Things disappeared in Hollowbrook. Objects refused to stay put. Even so, Hayes placed it in a sealed bag, tucked it in the locked cabinet himself. But the letter wasn't content to stay quiet. That night, as the sheriff sat in his office with the lights low, he swore he heard scratching. Faint, steady, coming from the cabinet where the letter lay. When he opened the drawer, the bag trembled. Inside, the ink seemed darker than before, as though freshly written. He didn't tell the deputies. Instead, he carried the bag home and placed it in the nightstand beside his bed. His wife later recalled waking in the small hours to find him sitting upright, the letter spread across his lap, muttering the words over and over. He returns with the moon. He returns with the moon. By morning, another body was found. A young man named Joseph Weller, laid across the stones, wound across the throat, peppermint sharp in the air. In his pocket was the familiar line, handwritten this time. He'll come again when the moon is full. The sheriff placed both messages side by side on his desk. One in the victim's pocket, one slipped under his own door. They were not identical, but they were bound together, like 2 halves of a chant. It was no longer just a phrase carried by the dead. It was a message delivered to the living. The curse was speaking directly now, and Hollowbrook could only listen. By 1976, Sheriff William Hayes was no longer the confident man who had taken Dawson's place. His suits hung loose on him, his hands shook when he tried to write, and his eyes had sunk into hollows, as if the November nights themselves had carved them out. The deputies whispered that he was unraveling, that he spent more time staring at calendars than case files, more time circling dates than pursuing leads. They said his logbooks were no longer filled with reports, but with fragments. Moon due in 5 days. I hear the water in my sleep. It's counting me, too. At home, his wife grew frightened. She claimed he woke screaming some nights, certain he heard footsteps pacing the hallway. Other times he rose silently, walked to the kitchen, and stood staring at the faucet as though waiting for it to whisper. The letter in green ink never left his side. Deputies saw him carry it folded in his breast pocket, his fingers straying to it during interviews as though it were a rosary. Once, when asked why he kept it so close, Hayes only muttered, "Because it listens when I do." By autumn, the sheriff had stopped trusting his deputies. Evidence vanished too often. Reports blurred, handwriting warped. He accused them of carelessness, even sabotage. But in his quieter moments, he admitted another possibility, that the brook itself erased what it didn't want remembered. One deputy later recalled finding Hayes at the brook late one night, lantern lit, boots sunk in mud. The sheriff was kneeling on the stones where the bodies were always laid. He had spread photographs across the wet rock, images of Peter, Margaret, Samuel, Alice, all of them. His lips moved constantly, whispering the victims' names, one after another. When the deputy asked what he was doing, Hayes looked up with wild eyes and said, "If I say them enough, the brook won't forget. If it forgets, they'll be gone forever." The deputy never reported it formally. He only told the story years later, when Hayes was long gone. The town noticed too. The sheriff's presence shrank. He no longer spoke at vigils. He no longer reassured grieving families. His voice, once firm, was thin and halting, as if each word were drawn unwillingly from him. And when November came again and another body appeared on the stones, Hayes didn't call a press conference. He didn't issue a statement. He simply stood at the brook with his hat in his hands, staring at the water until the deputies led him away. From then on, people said the curse had claimed another victim, not a body this time, but a man's mind. The brook did not just take the living. It hollowed the ones left behind. By the late 1970s, the brook no longer haunted Hollowbrook only in daylight or in crime scenes. It began creeping into the nights, into the sleep of those who tried hardest to ignore it. At first, it was just a handful of people. A farmer's wife who woke screaming that she'd been walking barefoot across the slick stones, a young boy who insisted his shoes were wet though he'd gone to bed dry. A schoolteacher who confessed, quietly, that she had dreamed of the brook whispering her name. Then the dreams spread. Each November, more reported the same vision. The brook, silver under the full moon, its water whispering words they could not understand. Always the stones at the bend, gleaming like an altar. Always the sense that someone else was there, just out of sight. When they woke, the details lingered. Sheets damp, as though water had seeped through. The faint, sharp tang of peppermint in the air. One man swore he found mud on the soles of his feet. Another claimed he woke with a small, white pebble in his palm, smooth as candy. The sheriff's office dismissed it as hysteria. "Shared grief," Hayes said in his final public statement before retreating fully into silence. But the townspeople knew better. It was Clara Monroe, Alice's younger cousin, who put it into words during a vigil. Standing among the candlelit crowd, her voice low but steady, she whispered, "The brook doesn't just take the dead. It calls the living. In dreams first, then in footsteps." Her words spread quickly, repeated in kitchens, in bars, in classrooms. The dreamers, they were called. People who claimed to feel the brook pressing against their sleep, tugging them toward its stones. Some resisted. They prayed. They locked their doors. They refused to sleep during November nights. Others gave in, wandering down toward the water in the dark, only to be pulled back by family before reaching the stones. One year, a boy named Simon was caught by his father halfway across the footbridge at midnight, barefoot, eyes closed. He had been sleepwalking. When shaken awake, he whispered only, "It was calling." The curse had always claimed its victims in the flesh. But now it was reaching deeper, into the silence of the mind, the vulnerable hours when Hollowbrook slept. And each November, more dreamers joined its rhythm. 4 beats, a pause, 4 again. The same pattern that haunted their waking hours now pulsed through their dreams. The brook was no longer just a place. It had become a visitor, and it was stepping through the town one sleeper at a time. Not everyone claimed by the curse ended up on the stones. A few slipped past the brook's grasp, but none of them were free of it. One of the best known was Richard Cole, a mill hand in his 20s. In November of 1978, he was walking home after the late shift, the moon heavy in the sky, when he felt it. The stillness, the pull, the sense that he was no longer walking alone. "I heard the steps," he would say years later, voice trembling. 4 behind me. A pause. 4 again. always just out of rhythm with mine. Richard broke into a run, boots pounding the dirt road. He swore the steps followed, never hurried, never slowing, just steady. He didn't stop until he reached his own porch, where his wife pulled him inside and bolted the door. That year, no body was found on the stones, the only November since 1962 without a death. The town whispered that the brook had chosen Richard, but he had outrun it. And perhaps, they said, that's why it took no one else that year. But Richard himself found no relief. From that night forward, he lived in dread. He stopped working the late shift. He refused to cross the footbridge. When November came, he boarded his windows and lit candles in every room, pacing through the nights with a shotgun in hand. His wife said he barely slept, and when he did, he woke drenched in sweat, muttering, "It's still waiting." Neighbors noticed changes too. Richard grew thinner, jumpier. He startled at small noises, flinched at footsteps behind him on Main Street. Children whispered that he smelled of peppermint, though he carried none. He tried to leave once, driving toward the next county. But before he reached the town line, his car stalled by the roadside. When he lifted the hood, he found water pooled in the engine. Though the day had been clear, no rain for weeks. He walked home in silence and never tried again. Richard Cole died in 1991 of a heart attack, only 45 years old. At his funeral, his brother leaned close to the coffin and whispered, "He carried the curse instead of the rest of us." In Hollowbrook, people still talk of that year, the only year without a November body. They say Richard took the place of the dead, not in flesh, but in spirit. That the brook had marked him and spared no one else until his heart gave out. Survival in Hollowbrook was not escape. It was a sentence of its own. By the early 1980s, the brook's whispers had taken on a new shape. Not just footsteps, not just dreams, but music. It was first noticed during a November storm. The rain came heavy that year, drumming against rooftops, rushing through gutters. Yet in the spaces between thunder, people swore they heard something else. A melody, thin, distant. An old harmonica, some said. A guitar string, others argued. Always faint, always bending with the wind, but too precise to be mistake. Notes strung together like someone playing from the bottom of the brook itself. One woman, Mary Keene, lived close enough to the water to hear it clearer than most. She claimed she recognized the tune, a simple lullaby her husband used to hum before he died in 1972. "It was him," she whispered to her daughter. "The brook let him play through the storm." Others dismissed it as grief, but Mary insisted, and she wasn't alone. A boy swore he heard his sister's voice woven into the rain, humming the same song she'd sung before she vanished. A man claimed the tune matched a hymn played at his wife's funeral. Each listener swore the song was different, yet familiar, personal, as though the brook tailored its music to whoever listened. And always, the rhythm was the same. 4 notes, a pause, 4 again. During one particularly fierce storm, a deputy patrolling the bridge pulled over, rolled down his window, and sat frozen in the driver's seat. Later he told the sheriff he had heard not just music, but words. A voice inside the rain itself, whispering, "We are not gone, only waiting." After that, few doubted. The brook was speaking, not through letters, not through footsteps, but through the very weather. The townsfolk grew restless. Some avoided the storms entirely, boarding their windows, burying their heads beneath pillows. Others stood at their porches, listening, desperate for the music to bring them a fragment of the ones they'd lost. And still, every November, the bodies appeared. The brook's song did not soothe. It did not spare. It only reminded. At the candlelight vigils, people began humming beneath their breath. Not hymns now, but the broken tunes they thought they'd heard in the rain, a strange, uneven chorus, not quite in unison, not quite human, as though the town itself had become an instrument, echoing the brook's song back to the water, and the brook, always steady, whispered on. In 1982, a young reporter named Calvin Price arrived in Hollowbrook, sent by a regional paper to write a feature on the town that mourned every November. He was sharp, ambitious, and dismissive of small-town superstition. At least at first. He spent weeks combing through the courthouse archives, poring over files no one had touched in years. Dust clung to his sleeves, ink smeared across his fingers. Most of it was repetition. Photographs of the stones, coroner's reports, the familiar line, "He'll come again when the moon is full." But buried in the back of a box labeled 1965, Calvin found something odd. A small, leather-bound notebook. No official tag, no evidence seal. Its pages warped with damp, edges blackened as if singed. Inside were sketches, crude, hurried, drawn in pencil that had smudged with age. Always the same scene. The brook under moonlight, the stones gleaming, and 4 figures standing at the water's edge. Not 3. 4. One sketch showed them clearly. 3 smaller shapes, drawn with delicate strokes, and one taller looming behind, always with a hat, brim low. The Peppermint Man. Between the drawings were fragments of text. Not full sentences, just phrases scrawled like a man writing faster than he could think. 4 beats. A pause. The stones are never empty. He waits behind them. Not mine, not mine. At the back of the journal, a final page carried a single line in ink that bled through the paper. If you see them, don't look back. Calvin asked the clerks who had kept the archives about the notebook. None remembered cataloging it. Some swore it hadn't been there before. He wrote his article anyway, careful not to sound like a fool. In the published piece, he described the murders as ritualistic and hinted at the possibility of a local cult. But in his private notes, never printed, he admitted something darker. The sketches were too many, too consistent. Whoever drew them saw something, or someone, and I think they wanted me to see it too. The notebook vanished months later. When Calvin returned to Hollowbrook in '83, it was gone from the archives, leaving only a space in the box where it had been. Some say the brook took it back. Others say Calvin kept it, unable to let go. But the sketches remained in his memory. 4 figures, always by the water. 3 familiar. 1 watching. And in Hollowbrook, people whispered that maybe the curse had never been about a single killer. Maybe it had always been about the 4. By the late 1990s, Hollowbrook had lived under the curse for nearly 4 decades. Entire generations had been born and raised in its shadow. Children grew into parents, parents into grandparents, and still each November the brook remembered. Then came 1999. Her name was Emily Hart, 24 years old, a nurse at the county clinic. Bright, steady, known for walking patients home if they seemed unwell. She wasn't reckless, wasn't a wanderer, wasn't the kind of girl who ignored warnings. But on the night of November's full moon, she didn't come back. Her car was found parked neatly by the roadside near the trees, keys still in the ignition, a peppermint candy resting on the dashboard. The next morning, hikers found her. Same stones, same posture, same wound across her throat. In her jacket pocket was a note, written in green ink, the letters slanted and precise. He'll come again when the moon is full. But he didn't. After Emily, the stones lay empty. November after November, the town braced, candles were lit, vigils held, but no new body appeared. And the curse, it seemed, had ended with her. Or perhaps it had paused. Some in Hollowbrook dared to hope. They whispered that Emily was the last, that she had been chosen to close the circle. Others said it was only silence stretching, waiting for the right name, the right night, the right moon. At Emily's funeral, Father Harrington, now old, his voice thin, said something that unsettled those who heard it. He leaned into the microphone and whispered, "She was not the last, only the latest." The church fell quiet, and in that silence the town remembered what it had always known. The brook did not forgive. The brook did not forget. It only waited. And though no bodies have been found since that night in 1999, the people of Hollowbrook still lock their doors when November comes. They still keep candles burning. They still smell peppermint in the fog. Because once a place has taken enough blood, its silence never truly ends. In the spring of 2000, months after Emily Hart's body was found on the brook's stones, Hollowbrook's cemetery gained something it had never ordered. One morning, the groundskeeper arrived to find a new headstone standing near the northern edge, where the grass dipped toward the tree line. The stone was pale granite, taller than the others, its edges rough as though carved quickly. No flowers lay at its base. No soil had been disturbed. It was simply there, as if it had risen overnight from the ground itself. At first glance, it appeared blank. But when the morning light struck it at an angle, words became visible, faintly etched into the granite. A list of names: Peter Lang, Margaret Kelly, Samuel Carter, Alice Monroe, Thomas Bell, Daniel Whitaker, Helen Fry, Joseph Weller, Emily Hart, and more. Dozens more. Every victim of the brook from 1962 to 1999. Each name written in precise order with dates of death that matched the sheriff's files exactly. No mason in town admitted to carving it. No invoices existed. No family had requested it. The stone had no marker of origin, no signature, no quarry record. When the sheriff's deputies examined it, they found the surface oddly cold, colder than the morning air. When they touched the etched names, their fingers came away damp, as though the stone itself wept condensation. The townspeople gathered, whispering prayers, leaving flowers though they didn't know where to place them. Some said the stone was a gift, a monument raised by the dead themselves, a way of keeping their memory from fading into silence. Others muttered that it was a warning, that the brook had claimed its due and was marking its territory. At night, teenagers dared one another to stand before it under the full moon. They swore the names glowed faintly then, silver lines shimmering like water. A few claimed the order of names shifted, new ones appearing, though none could prove it by daylight. The priest refused to consecrate the stone. He said it was not holy ground, that it had been placed without blessing. Still, the stone remained. No storm cracked it, no vandal marked it, no grass grew over its base. And each November, when the candles were lit by the brook, families also gathered at the stone, reading the list in silence. Line after line, name after name. It stood as a reminder. The brook did not just take. It remembered. And Hollowbrook, whether it wanted to or not, remembered too. By the time the new century began, William Hayes was no longer sheriff. He had retired in the late 80s, but Hollowbrook never let him go. He lived in a modest house on Ashen Hill Road, curtains always drawn, his lawn left to weeds. Those who saw him said he walked with a stoop now, as if the brook itself had bent him. Most assumed he had gone silent. But one winter night he broke that silence, not in public, but in a whispered confession to the town's priest. Father Harrington, old and brittle but still keeping his parish, received a knock at his rectory door well past midnight. Hayes stood there, hat in his hands, eyes hollow. The priest let him in, sat him down, and poured him tea. Hayes didn't touch it. Instead, he began to speak. He said that years ago, during one of the November vigils, he had gone alone to the brook after the candles had guttered out. He wanted to stand on the stones himself, to feel what the victims had felt, to see if the silence would open to him. He stood there in the fog, the brook whispering beneath him, when he heard it. A voice. Not loud, not even clear. Just a whisper that curled inside his ear like a breath. Not your fault. Hayes froze. The mist thickened, the peppermint sharp enough to sting his eyes. He felt the presence behind him, tall, narrow, waiting. He didn't turn. He couldn't. The voice came again, softer, almost kind. Not your fault. And then it was gone. The water whispered on. The stones chilled beneath his boots. He stumbled away, heart hammering, never speaking of it to anyone. Until that night in the rectory. Father Harrington pressed him. Whose voice had it been? Male? Female? Did he recognize it? Hayes only shook his head. It wasn't one voice, he whispered. It was all of them. Every name on that stone. The priest sat in silence, unsure whether to believe him. Hayes rose to leave, placing his hat back on his head. At the door, he turned and said one last thing. The brook forgives, Father, but not in the way we want. He never spoke of it again. Weeks later, he suffered a stroke and passed quietly in his sleep. At his funeral, Harrington did not share the confession, but the weight of it clung to him. And in Hollowbrook, rumors spread anyway. People said the sheriff had carried a secret to his grave, that the brook had whispered to him, not to condemn, but to absolve. But absolution in Hollowbrook was never comfort. It was only another kind of silence. It happened in 2004, 5 years after Emily Hart's body had been laid on the stones. The killings had stopped, or so the town told itself. November passed with candles and silence, but no blood. People wanted to believe the curse had ended. Then the calls began. The first came to the Weller family. Joseph Weller had been one of the victims back in 1975. His sister, long grown with children of her own, lived 3 counties away. One November night, just after 3 a.m., the phone rang. She answered, half asleep. There was no voice, only static. And beneath it, faint but clear, the sound of rain. Not outside her window. Outside it was dry, but inside the line itself, dripping steady against her ear. She whispered hello, twice. No answer. Then through the static, a voice surfaced. Thin, layered, male and female, old and young all at once. A chorus pulled through a narrow wire. It spoke only 6 words. He returns when the moon is full. The line went dead. The next night, another call. This time to the Whitakers, who had fled Hollowbrook decades before. Same hour, same static, same rain. This time the voice whispered, not finished, never finished. By the end of the week, at least 6 families of past victims reported the same thing. Always at 3 a.m., always static and rain. Always a voice that did not belong to one person, but to many. The sheriff's office investigated the numbers. Phone companies traced nothing unusual. No origin, no record. As though the calls had never been placed. The town tried to dismiss it as pranksters, teenagers, outsiders stirring fear. But those who had heard the voice knew better. They swore it was the same rhythm, the same cadence as the brook itself. 4 beats, a pause, 4 again. One woman, Margaret Kelly's niece, refused to unplug her phone after the call. She left it on her nightstand, waiting for it to ring again. When asked why, she only said, "It was the first time since she died that she sounded close." The killings had stopped, but the brook had found a new way to whisper, not through stones, not through rain, through wires, and each November since, families of the dead live with the same dread, not of footsteps behind them, but of the phone ringing at 3 in the morning. because when Hollowbrook calls, you cannot hang up. The year 2000 came and went, then 2010, then 2020, and still no more bodies appeared on the stones. The files yellowed in the courthouse basement, the vigils dwindled, and the new generation grew up hearing the story not as a fact, but as folklore. Yet Hollowbrook never forgot. Every November, when the moon waxes full, the town grows quiet in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. Porch lights burn late. Curtains are drawn tight. Children are told to hush, to listen. Because even if no body has been found in decades, the brook is still there. It whispers. The water moves with its steady rhythm. 4 beats, a pause, 4 again. The same rhythm that once marked footsteps, once echoed in dreams, once hummed through the rain. The same rhythm carved into the memory of a town that learned silence too well. The cemetery stone still stands on the northern edge, its names unweathered, its surface still damp when touched. Teenagers dare each other to read the names aloud under the moonlight, but most stop halfway, their voices breaking. The last name, Emily Hart, glows faintly in silver when the fog rolls in. And sometimes, when the phone rings at 3 in the morning, families of the dead still lift the receiver with trembling hands. Static. Rain. A whisper too faint to hold, too near to forget. Some say the killings ended. Others say the brook is only waiting. That silence itself is the cruelest part of the curse. Because silence is not empty. It is full of names, of footsteps, of songs half heard in the rain. The brook still runs black beneath the trees. The stones still gleam when the moon is full. The peppermint still stings the air on cold nights. And in Hollowbrook, everyone knows. The silence is not gone. It remains. It waits. It always will.